Welcome everybody to the DeFord lecture series. We're very happy this week to have Mattheos Santamouris coming to us from the future. My understanding is that it's Friday where he is, and so we'll hear a little bit more about Matt and his research in just a minute. But I just want to welcome everybody here to the DeFord lecture series. This is a long-standing tradition in the Department of Geological Sciences going back to the late 1940s. And it's named after Ronald Kinnison DeFord, who was a faculty member and a graduate advisor in the department for many years, starting in 1948 when he joined the department. He was very active in organizing and running what was then known as the technical sessions, venue for researchers from both within and outside the department to present their research. And so today we are very excited to have Mattheos Santamouris joining us from the University of New South Wales. And to tell us a little bit more about Matt and his research, I will hand things over to Dev Niyogi.
Welcome, Professor Mattheos Santamouris, and welcome all the attendees to this DeFord lecture. This is a very special day for me because we have been working on these issues related to urban climate, urban heat, urban extremes for nearly a decade. And there's one name which has evolved and morphed himself into becoming almost legendary in this field, and that is Professor Mattheos Santamouris. And least of not, but he has over 450 publications. He has written over 25 books. 12 of them are the books he has written, 13 that he has edited or so. Numerous projects across the world. So it's not just in the context of his theoretical understanding and the framework by which he has developed the field, but also where he really stands out is he has transcended and taken the steps to take the framework that he has studied into applying it to cities, that what can cities do to become cooler, what can cities do to become net zero in terms of the carbon emissions. So there's a tremendous body of work that has been done and influenced by what Matt has been doing for many years. I'm very pleased that we are actually co-editing a book together on global heat islands, which should be coming out soon. But I'll lay the floor open to Professor Santamouris. And
Thank you so much, John. Thank you so much, Deb, for your nice words. Thank you very much for your invitation. I will stop the video because unfortunately my internet connection is not the best possible. And let's start the discussion. This lecture will, let's say, try to discuss issues related to urban overheating, discuss about the magnitude of urban overheating, how really we can evaluate the magnitude and, let's say, the characteristics of urban overheating, and also trying really to investigate the interaction between the global and the regional climatic change. In the second part, we will try to discuss the impact of urban overheating on energy, health, environmental quality, survivability. And the last part has to do with the development, the presentation of the development of the main mitigation technologies, and also the potential of the mitigation technologies, and some results from large-scale implementation of, let's say, the mitigation technologies all around the world. Is it urban overheating a serious problem? Yes, it is one of the most serious problems around the world. According to a recent publication, there are more than 13,000 overheated cities around the world. There is about 1.7 billion people under severe overheating. Since 1980, the number of overheating hours has almost increased by 300%. And in total, there are 118 billion overheating hours, man hours around the world. So, I'm sorry, it seems that is one of the major climatic problems around the world. And urban overheating, it has to do with the increase of the temperature in our cities, in the more dense part of the cities, or, in the center of the cities because of the positive thermal balance in the urban environment, and the big difference between the, let's say, urban and the rural areas. This is because of, let's say, the anthropogenic heat, which is released by car, combustion system, etc., the high absorption of solar radiation, the advected heat, the, let's say, emission of infrared radiation by urban canyons, and many other issues. So is it a well-documented phenomena, let's say, of climatic change? Yes. We have monitored data, we have measured data from more than 450 cities all around the world, which shows that the, let's say, intensity and the magnitude of urban overheating may be as high as 10 or 11 degrees. I show you now a recent collection of data from Asian and Australian cities that you can see, for example, that the average overheating magnitude is close to 5 degrees. But there are cities, especially in India and China, where overheating may exceed 10 degrees. But problem of urban overheating is not just the increase of the temperature of our cities. It has also to do with the increase of the duration of the hot spells. If we try to plot the number of days during summer of the duration of hot spells from 1890 to 2000 and 2020, you will see, for example, that the number of hours above 37 degrees, the red bars, has increased tremendously during the very last years. The same also happened regarding the number of hours above 40 degrees. Also, once we try really to check the magnitude of urban overheating, and especially the number of heat wave episodes above 37 degrees, from the beginning of the past century up to our days, you will see that there's a tremendous increase of the magnitude, but also a very important increase of the frequency of extreme events. So urban overheating is the increase of the temperature of our cities, together with the increase of the temperature, increase of the duration of the hot spells, and the increase of the magnitude and the frequency of, let's say, extreme climatic events, heat waves. Do we have a good knowledge of the characteristics of the phenomena? Yes, because either we monitor urban heat island using, let's say, space technologies, and we understand the magnitude of the so-called surface heat island, or with ground, let's say, stations, we can have a lot of information about the distribution of the temperature, but also we have very powerful monitoring and also, simulation tools like mesoscale modeling that allows us to understand in good details the characteristics of urban heat island. You see, for example, here in Sydney, the results of mesoscale modeling that shows that in the difference of temperature between the eastern part of the city, which is the coastal part, and the western part of the city, which is, let's say, close to the desert, is about 10 degrees. So in a distance of about, let's say, 40 kilometers, there is 10 degrees of temperature difference. But it's not just that. During the very last years, we have understood that there is a very special, let's say, link and synergies between the global climatic change, the extreme heat events, and also the magnitude of the urban heat island. And we know now that because of during the extreme climatic events, the magnitude of the urban heat island is increasing, let's say, considerably. For example, you can see in Sydney that during heat waves, the magnitude of the urban heat island is increasing by about 5 degrees. And this is because of the higher, let's say, high of the planetary boundary layer that increases the advected heat to the city from the desert. There are many reasons that really contribute to increase the magnitude of the urban heat island during, let's say, extreme events. And there are many cities around the world where really it is shown that during extreme, let's say, climatic conditions, and these are results from Athens, Greece, the magnitude of the urban heat island is increasing between 3 to 5 degrees for different reasons. So there is a very important, let's say, connection and synergy between the two phenomena. So climatic change has, and urban climatic change or urban overheating has to do with higher temperatures, longer hot spells, higher frequency of heat waves, higher magnitude of heat waves, and there is a very strong interaction and synergy between global and local climatic change. It is evident that the increase of the temperature in our cities may have a tremendous impact on energy, on health, pollution, vulnerability, economy, comfort, and everything. During the very last years, we have performed a lot of studies trying to understand really the impact of urban overheating on the different, let's say, aspects of our life, and especially on energy. So urban overheating affects very much the supply of energy and also the, let's say, use of energy. It is evident that because of the higher temperature, let's say the energy consumption of buildings, and especially for cooling purposes, is increasing tremendously. On the other hand, it increases very much the peak electricity demand, obliging utilities to build additional power plants, increases the frequency of blackouts, but also it has a tremendous impact on, let's say, the production and the supply of electricity. We need additional power plants. We have power disruptions. We have decreased efficiency because of the higher temperature. We have much higher increased electricity losses. Can we quantify all these, let's say, impacts? Do we know exactly what is the real impact of urban overheating on energy? Yes. During the last years, data from several cities has allowed us to understand that the global energy penalty, let's say, a square meter of city is close to the average, of course, 2.3 kilowatt hours per square meter, while the global energy penalty per square meter of city and the degree of temperature increase is close to 0.7 kilowatt hours per degree and square meter. Or if you wish, the global energy penalty per person is close to 230 kilowatt hours per person, or per degree of temperature increase is 78 kilowatt hours per temperature increase in person. So it is very important, and it is a very significant impact, the 230 kilowatt hours per person that we have to consume, in order really to compensate the impact of urban heat island and the impact of urban overheating is really a very important problem. This is very well, let's say, very well verified and validated through real measurements of the energy consumption in several cities. And I'd like to show you the results from Seoul city in Korea, where we have monitored the energy consumption for cooling purposes of thousands of buildings located at the center of the city under urban heat island or out of the city. And we have found that the average monthly cooling energy consumption is increasing between 0.2 kilowatt hours per square meter up to 2 kilowatt hours per square meter, which is really very important, let's say, energy increase. So the energy impact of urban overheating is very well, let's say, determined, very well known, very well documented. And this brings us to the very important problem that we may face in the future energy consumption for cooling. If we try to plot the actual energy consumption for cooling all around the world, it is quite low. It represents about, let's say, 10 to 12% of the total energy consumption in the residential sector. But given the tremendous increase of the temperature in our cities, the global climatic change, the increase of the population, the increase of the floor area per building, the increased consumption, and the increased availability of air conditioning, we expect that the energy consumption for cooling will increase tremendously by 2050. There are three scenarios. The low development scenario predicts that by 2050, the total energy consumption for cooling may increase up to 320%. under, let's say, an average development scenario, the increase of the energy consumption for cooling may be of the order of magnitude of 750%, while under a high development scenario, the increase of the cooling demand may be of the order of magnitude of 2,270%. Of course, when uncertainties are taken into account, this increase may be much, much higher. And this brings us to the major question, really, how to face the problem of urban overheating and how really to find the proper resources to satisfy such a demand. Such an increase of the energy consumption for cooling will be a tremendous problem for developing cities. There are studies showing, for example, that just one city, Indian city, Mumbai, may present by 2050 higher energy consumption for cooling than the whole United States. But it's not just the increase of the energy consumption for cooling. Urban overheating is increasing the concentration of harmful pollutants, and especially of ozone. 87% of the increase of the cases of the increase of ozone is because of, let's say, overheating. And the increase of the concentration of urban overheating, of ozone because of the urban overheating is quite high. For example, the limits or the thresholds for health protection around, the world, the average is around 110 units. But in average, the 1 hour average is 180. The warning that really happens many times around the world is 300. But in the future, many studies predict that the concentration of ozone may increase up to 400%. And ozone is a killer. On the other hand, we know very well that because of the urban overheating, pollution is increasing. And for each degree of temperature increase, the pollutants emitted by, let's say, the power plants increase by almost 3%. So for each degree of temperature increase, pollutants emitted by the power plants increases by almost 3%. Apart of the impact of urban overheating on energy and, let's say, pollution, environmental quality, one of the major, let's say, impact it has to do with, let's say, the vulnerable population. We know that vulnerable population lives in low quality buildings in deprived area of cities, and this has a tremendous impact, on their quality of life. For sure, urban overheating increases the vulnerability of low-income population, increases the use of air conditioning by almost 100%. Studies shown that vulnerable population living in low-quality buildings, they need almost 100% more cooling to compensate urban overheating than, let's say, the average. And also, we face serious problems of indoor environmental quality during heat waves. This graph represents the indoor temperature or the average indoor temperature in about 400 low-income houses in Athens, Greece, during a heat wave. You can see that before the heat wave, indoor temperature was, let's say, close to 26 degrees. But after, let's say, 5 days of heat wave, the average temperature was close to 32, 33 degrees. And we had many houses with temperatures close really to 40 degrees. And we had houses with temperatures above 35 degrees for more than 3 days. The same happens, for example, in, let's say, in Sydney, in Western Sydney, not during a heat wave, indoor temperatures in low-income houses may be as high as 40 degrees. And this brings us to the major problem and the major impact of urban overheating, which has to do with, let's say, health. And the impact of urban overheating on health is not something which is really simple. It is very much related to several, let's say, parameters, and mainly demographic parameters and demographic factors, which really affect the health of the population, socioeconomic factors, and also the quality of the health infrastructure in the different cities. In average, a recent study has shown that people living in, let's say, overheated parts of cities, in average, present 6% higher heat-related mortality than the rest of the population in our cities. So there's a tremendous penalty that is paid because of the urban overheating in our cities. And this is very well known through different studies all around the world. I'd like to show you the results of a recent study in Europe that correlates and associates the apparent temperature against the mortality rate. And this is really the relation in Athens, Greece. You see, for example, that above 32 degrees, there's a tremendous increase of the mortality. And the same happens also for most of the Mediterranean cities, where really we can see that during, let's say, high temperatures, the mortality is increasing once temperature is really exceeding 28 to 32 degrees. It's not the same in, let's say, cooling in heating-dominated climates. Once we plot the same, let's say, curves for heating-dominated climates, for example, London or Stockholm, or Copenhagen or Helsinki, we will see that the threshold for, let's say, urban problems on health and the health threshold over which mortality is increasing is much, much lower, is really increasing above 22, 23 degrees. So we don't behave the same way against urban overheating. In, let's say, heating-dominated climates, the threshold temperature above which urban overheating or above which heat-related mortality is increasing is much lower than in cooling-dominated climates. And this is very important once really we plan the future and we try to assess the future of health in our cities. The same happens, for example, in Sydney. You can see, for example, the distribution of the excess deaths per 100,000 people during the period of 2016-2017. You can see that, for example, in the western part of the city, which is the most, let's say, overheated part of the city because of the proximity to the desert, heat-related mortality was 3 times higher than in the eastern part of the city. So this is an extremely well-documented phenomena that really needs our attention. As I mentioned before, this is not a very simple, phenomena, and many parameters has to be taken into account. And mainly, what is very important is to understand the role of our, let's say, quality of our outdoor environment, but also of the indoor environment and the quality of our houses. A recent study has shown that, urban heat island and overheating outdoors may increase, let's say, by 6.1 deaths per million, the heat-related mortality. But once this is combined with, let's say, low quality indoor environment, this is increasing by a factor of 3 or 4 and goes up to 23.5 deaths per million. So heat-related mortality is really a complex phenomenon that very much relates to, let's say, outdoor environment, urban overheating, but also the quality of our housing. I tried really to present, let's say, the main impact of urban overheating on energy, on environmental quality, on survivability, and also on health. But really, these are the bad news. This is really what we know about the actual problem. Do we have good news? Yes. During the last, let's say, 15, 20 years, there is a very important research that has been carried out, trying really to develop mitigation technologies in order to decrease the temperature of our cities. And these mitigation technologies have to do with the development of several technologies like evaporative technologies, cool roofs, increased vegetation in our cities, cool pavements, and many other, let's say, technologies that have been developed, tested, implemented in order to decrease the temperature of our cities. I will try really to go through the main developments of overheating, and I will try really to concentrate on the development of the more promising mitigation technologies the use of the so-called cool materials, or the use of intelligent materials in order to decrease the temperature of our cities. We started, let's say, almost 20 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, with the development of, let's say, high reflective white coatings. And then we developed the so-called color infrared reflective coatings. And gradually we developed several materials. And today we have very powerful super cool materials that really may decrease the temperature of our cities up to several degrees. I will try really to go through the recent developments and present you some really of the most important developments on mitigation technologies, and especially on cool materials for mitigation technologies. And I will try to concentrate on three main technologies: thermochromic technologies, photonic technologies, and fluorescent technologies. Thermochromic technologies have to do with, let's say, the development of materials which can change the color as a function of the outdoor temperature. So we may have, let's say, a material that during the winter may be dark, absorbing solar radiation, and during the summer may be white, may be reflective, let's say reflecting solar radiation. You see, for example, in this graph, the development and, let's say, the image of some thermochromic materials. These thermochromic materials have been developed and are tested. And we have succeeded to decrease the surface temperature of these materials up to 21 degrees. And you see in the right part of this slide, the difference between the thermochromic materials and the infrared reflective, let's say, cool materials, or the cool, or let's say the common materials. These, let's say, thermochromic materials have been developed, and at the initial phase presented important aging problems. Now we have developed, let's say, some optical filters which are applied on the thermochromic materials, and we have increased tremendously the, let's say, lifespan of the thermochromic materials. Thermochromic materials are now commercialized, and they may be used in the near next, let's say, years in order really to decrease the temperature of our cities. But there are many promising, let's say, new developments regarding thermochromic technologies, and especially the use of photonic crystals and plasmonic crystals for thermochromic, materials. These new materials, which really are under development and we work on it, present outstanding features of nanoscale thermochromic materials compared to, let's say, the bulk counterparts in the low rate of photodegradation. And the major, let's say, benefit and the major advantage of this material is that really they do not represent any problem of aging, while the, let's say, the potential for temperature depression is very, very high. These materials are not yet into the market, but we expect that in the next 2 or 3 years, photonic thermochromic materials will be available. The major developments regarding, let's say, mitigation materials, it has to do with the development of radiative cooling materials. Radiative cooling materials, or photonic materials, are materials that present a very high reflectivity in, let's say, the solar radiation, but also a very high emissivity in the so-called, let's say, atmospheric window between 8 to 13 micrometers. So we may have a very high reflection of the incident solar radiation, but also a very high emission of, let's say, the heat by the materials, which really is emitted in the atmospheric window, which means that can escape to, let's say, the space. So in this case, we may have, let's say, very low surface temperatures. We have developed this kind of of photonic materials, and I show you some of the last testing we have performed in the desert of Australia, in Alice Springs, during last summer. And as you can see from this graph, we have succeeded to decrease the surface temperature of these materials up to 17 degrees below the ambient temperature during the daytime under the sun. So this is a natural air conditioner. while the ambient temperature was close to 40, 45 degrees, the surface temperature of these materials was close to 25, 26 degrees. These materials are developed and are tested now in real applications, and especially in a big project of mitigation we have in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. And I can show you the distribution of the temperature and the decrease of the temperature, let's say, across the city during a typical day. By using, let's say, in temperature in an environment, in a very, let's say, hot or warm environment in Riyadh, and the supercool materials, we can really decrease the temperature up to 4 or 5 degrees. And this is really a major achievement. At the same time, we may have, let's say, important changes in the airflow because of the decrease of, let's say, the planetary boundary layer. And you see, for example, here, the results of the use of supercool materials in Calcutta in India. However, the use of the supercool materials have a serious problem. During the winter period, may create some problems of overcooling, increasing the heating energy demand of buildings. And our testing has shown that the use of the supercool materials may decrease the ambient temperature during the winter up to 2 degrees. So this is a major drawback. And the recent developments we have, let's say, the recent scientific developments and the recent, let's say, research we have carried out has allowed us first to create, a new generation of supercool materials where the emissivity and the reflectivity of the materials is modulated. So we may, let's say, have very high reflectivity and very high emissivity during, let's say, the summer period, and very low emissivity and very low, let's say, reflectivity during the winter period. When this happens, we may have, let's say, a decrease of the peak temperature of the cities up to 4 or 5 degrees, but also in summer, but also during the winter period, the temperature of the city may increase up to 2 degrees. So this kind of materials is a win-win, let's say, win-win technology that may decrease considerably the peak temperature of our cities, but at the same time may increase the temperature of our cities if we wish to have an increase during the winter period. We try to further improve the performance of these supercool materials, of photonic materials, by using, let's say, technologies that allows to emit the radiation through the materials, but not to absorb the atmospheric radiation. This is, let's say, a little bit difficult. There are different technologies that have been tested, is not yet, let's say, achieved, but once really this new technology is developed, we expect that we may decrease the surface temperature of the materials up to 30 or 35 degrees. The third, let's say, technology of mitigation materials that I like to propose you and present you, it has to do with the development of fluorescent cooling materials. Fluorescent cooling materials, and especially quantum dots, are very small semiconductor particles which have a very specific characteristic: do not absorb heat. Once heat is absorbed, or once, let's say, solar radiation is absorbed by the material, immediately it is re-emitted under the form of, let's say, fluorescent. So the temperature really remains the same, or let's say is decreasing. The use of new generation fluorescent materials allows to have, let's say, emission of higher energy than the absorbed energy. So this kind of materials can be a natural air conditioning, decreasing the temperature. We have developed this kind of fluorescent cooling materials, and the first generation of these materials with, let's say, a low fluorescent efficiency has allowed us to decrease the surface temperature of these materials by, let's say, 2 degrees. This is not really very important compared to the developments of, let's say, the thermochromic or the photonic materials, but the second generation of these materials which really uses a combination of reflective materials and also fluorescent materials, has allowed us to decrease the surface temperature of these materials up to, let's say, 11, 12 degrees. And this is already, let's say, achieved and maybe commercialized the next period. But we are working on the development of a new technology of fluorescent materials, and especially materials that present anti-Stokes, as we say, properties, which means that they emit more than what they absorb. And in this case, we expect to achieve a temperature decrease up to 35 degrees. So where we are? During the very last years, we started with conventional, let's say, materials, and you see in the upper right part, the temperature, measured temperature of black surfaces in, let's say, urban environments, in cities, and gradually, by developing, let's say, black reflective materials, we have decreased the temperature, then, let's say, thermochromic black surfaces, and then very high efficiency white surfaces, and finally, daytime radiative coolers or photonic materials, which present up to 20 degrees low surface temperature. So in our days and during the last 20 years, we have succeeded to have materials, which most of them are now commercialized, which really may decrease the surface temperature of cities up to, let's say, 15 degrees, and the ambient temperature of cities up to, let's say, 4 or 5 degrees. So if we try to follow, let's say, the developments of mitigation technologies, we started with, let's say, the white reflective materials, which achieved, or given us a decrease of the temperature up to 0.5 degrees. And then we moved to infrared reflective materials, which achieved, a decrease of the temperature 0.6, 0.7 degrees. We continue with, let's say, new materials for, let's say, pavements, and also thermochromic materials, which extended the capacity of mitigation materials up to, let's say, 1.5 degrees, and then quantum dots fluorescent materials that may decrease the temperature up to 2.5 degrees, and then, let's say, daytime radiative cooling or photonic materials that may decrease the temperature up to, let's say, 2.5, 3 degrees. Actually, I'm sorry. We have more than 450 large-scale mitigation projects all around the world, where the temperature, the peak temperature, has decreased by 2.5 degrees. And we expect in the near future that through the use of, let's say, the high efficiency fluorescent and photonic materials, we may decrease the temperature of cities up to 4 or 5 degrees. This, especially the important decrease of the temperature of our cities, has a tremendous impact on energy consumption of our buildings. Our studies for Riyadh in Saudi Arabia has shown that the use of the supercool materials may decrease tremendously the peak electricity demand and also the energy consumption for buildings. And especially, we may have a decrease of the energy consumption, especially in areas like, let's say, Riyadh, up to 10 kilowatt hours per square meter per year by just using supercool materials at the building, let's say, surface, and also at, let's say, the urban scale. And this is very clear that we can really have a decrease of the energy consumption of our buildings or of our cities up to 15 degrees or 15% once these materials are used. And this has a tremendous impact on our cities. Studies for Sydney, and especially trying really to elaborate future scenarios, shows that, let's say, actually in the upper right part, the red part shows the actual cooling demand of buildings. The yellow part shows the heating demand. By 2050, because of the urban overheating, we expect an increase of the cooling demand by, let's say, 300% without a substantial decrease of the heating demand. However, once we are using mitigation and adaptation technologies by 2050, we may decrease the cooling demand up to 80–90% and the heating demand up to 50 or 60%. So there is hope. And the development of these materials and of the future materials may, let's say, decrease the temperature of our cities and decrease at the same time the, let's say, energy consumption of our buildings. But it's not just that. Studies have shown that the use of mitigation materials may have a tremendous impact on our health, and especially on heat-related mortality. Studies have shown that an increase of the albedo of the cities by 0.1 decreases the temperature of our cities by 0.01 degrees, and this corresponds almost between 0.1 to 4 deaths per day. In average, the decrease of death close to 20% per decrease of temperature drop. So once really we decrease the temperature of our cities by 1 degree, in average, we may decrease heat-related mortality by 20%. And these are results from more than 60, let's say, cities all around the world. Similar results are taken also once we use green infrastructure or we increase the green infrastructure in our cities. We may decrease, heat-related mortality considerably once really we decrease the temperature of our cities. So trying really to conclude this short presentation, I like really to stress that actually we have a serious problem of urban overheating. Cities present almost 6 to 10 degrees higher temperature during the summer, and we have more than 450 cities all around the world which present such a problem of overheating. On the other hand, urban overheating and increase of the temperature of our cities has a tremendous impact on the energy consumption of our buildings. It may increase the energy consumption up to 100%. Also, there's a tremendous impact on heat-related mortality. There are cases that because of the urban overheating, heat-related mortality may increase up to 300%. Also, there is a tremendous impact of the peak electricity demand, which obliges utility to build additional power plant. We have cases that the peak electricity demand is increasing by about 100% because of the urban overheating. Mitigation techniques really has contributed a lot to decrease the temperature of our cities. Actually, we are able to decrease the temperature of our cities up to 2.5, let's say, degrees. We hope that in the near future, we may decrease the temperature up to 4 degrees. On the other hand, we know that the use of advanced mitigation technologies may decrease, in average, the energy consumption of buildings up to 40% and perhaps more once supercool materials are used. Also, we know very well that the use of the mitigation technologies may, let's say, decrease heat-related mortality up to 40 or 50, 45%, and at the same time decrease considerably, let's say, the peak electricity demand of our cities. However, in order really to plan the future, in our cities, it is very important to understand that there is an important synergy between, let's say, the different sectors affected by urban overheating: energy, health, pollution, vulnerability, comfort, etc. Actually, as scientists, as researchers, we study, let's say, each one of the different sectors individually. We don't see the synergies between them, and this is a very important problem. So we have people and we have colleagues working, for example, on the development of, let's say, new technologies. We have people working on energy, we have people working on health, we have people working on pollution, but we don't have, let's say, a synergy between the different disciplines, which do not allow us to understand the vertical and at the same time the horizontal impact of urban overheating. So it is extremely important that in the near future, all studies that have to do with urban overheating and all studies that have to do with mitigation and adaptation take into consideration all the aspects and all the disciplines of urban overheating, especially energy demand, energy generation, health, pollution, vulnerability, economy. And we adopt a new, let's say, protocol in order to study and perform research regarding local and regional climatic change. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Matt. I think, Professor Santamouris, this was informative. I think we are all looking in terms of future climate mitigation, but we also have a very local problem that we can solve and get immediate effects if we invest in it. That's the message we are hearing loud and clear. We thank you very much again, and I'll let it off to John Lester again. So thank you.
Thank you again for a very, very interesting talk. Thank you for taking your morning and talking to us from Friday. And thank you everybody for coming this afternoon, and hope to see you here again in the near future.